Hi, psychology students. So the purpose of this video is to start talking about the disorders in Chapter 15 on psychopathology. So I'm going to begin by calling up the PowerPoint slides, sharing them with you. So in the previous video, I defined abnormality, talked about the 4 characteristics that have to exist in order for something to be able to be called a psychological disorder. And I talked at length about the DSM-5 and how it's fluid and how it changes. And there've been many versions of it, and how you have access to a free version of it in the link in the supplementary information that you might find especially useful as you write your first writing assignment. The instructions for the writing assignment are in this unit under A5, assignment 5. So you probably want to look at that this week and start working on it this week, week 6. So one thing that you need to know is that as we go through these disorders, I'm acting as though each disorder is its own unique thing. But in reality, there's what we call comorbidity. And comorbidity is when someone has more than one disorder. And about 41% of people who have a disorder have more than one disorder. So we call it comorbidity. And certain disorders are even more likely to experience comorbidity than others. So for example, ADHD. Less than 50% of people with ADHD have only ADHD. So the majority of people with ADHD also have something else. Perhaps it's major depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder or a substance abuse issue. So comorbidity is when people have more than one diagnosis. Okay. So we're going to begin talking about the anxiety disorders. So and I'm starting here because this is the first one that's talked about in your textbook, but I'm also talking about it first because it is by far the most common of all of the psychological disorders, by far. So within any 12-month period, about 23% of women and 14% of men will experience at least one anxiety disorder. That's within a given year. And you can see the statistic on here that 20 to 25% of the US population meets the criteria for at least one anxiety disorder during their lifetime. So this is very, very common. You can see how it's more common in women than men. And because it is so common, I want to talk about it first. So an anxiety disorder, you're going to see as we go through the different types, the anxiety disorders include excessive and persistent fear and anxiety and disturbances in behavior. And they're excessive. This is beyond just regular, I'm afraid of. Okay, this is extreme. This isn't being a worrywart. That can be within the normal range of behaviors. This is excessive and persistent fear and anxiety that ends up affecting your behavior. It has to meet those 4 criteria we talked about earlier. Okay, so let's start talking about the specific kinds. So the first one I'm going to talk about are the phobic disorders. So with a phobic disorder, you have excessive, distressing, and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or a specific situation. And I love how your book gives this table with all of these different specific ones. So fear of heights, we call acrophobia. Fear of flying, or aerophobia. Fear of spiders, arachnophobia. Fear of blood, hematophobia. And so on and so on. You can see here. All of these, claustrophobia, being afraid of enclosed spaces. So this is beyond like, oh, I'm uncomfortable in a closed space. I don't like being on elevators because they're uncomfortable. That's not claustrophobia. So claustrophobia is going to be excessive, distressing, persistent fear and anxiety. So much so that you're not going to take the elevator and you're going to climb up 6 flights of stairs to go to your class. Now, you might say, well, that has some health benefits, so it's not a problem. And it might not be, but it could become a problem if suddenly you get a job and your job is on the 25th floor of a building. Well, now being claustrophobic is now you might actually fit the criteria of having a phobic disorder because now it's impacting your life. You can't take that job because of where it's located. It's impacting your life in a negative way. Okay, so phobic disorder, excessive distressing and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or a specific situation. Okay, and about 12.5% of the people in the US will meet the criteria of having a phobic disorder at some point in their life. So right now, I would like you to stop this video and watch the next video the next video that's listed after this one. It's the one that's called the bird feather video. And in the bird feather video, it's a video about a woman who has a phobia of birds. And I'm only showing you in that video a small part of that series. She lives in fear of birds. And in a prior version, I only gave you access to the small piece because I don't want to take a lot of your time. It's not necessary. But in earlier versions of it, she talks about how she and her daughter went to the beach and she saw a seagull on the beach, and the seagull wasn't even that close to her. And she became so anxious and so afraid that she ran away, ran to the hotel as quickly as she could. And as soon as she got to the hotel, she realized that she had left her 3-year-old daughter on the beach. So she went running back to the beach and got her daughter and said, okay, this is a phobic disorder. This has gotten out of hand. I need to get help. And so you'll see in the video, she's with a therapist working on her phobic disorder. And in it, I can't remember if it's in the video that you see or in a prior one, she talks about how her grandmother told her that when she was very little, a bird came into a window and was trying to find its way out and kept banging against all different things. And there was blood of the bird and loud noises and feathers dropping everywhere. And when she was a little girl, this was a very traumatic experience for her. And ever since then, she, like to her knowledge, she's always been afraid of feathers and birds ever since then. One of the things that I really like about this video clip is that it shows you that a phobic disorder is much different than just having fear. Like you'll see how petrified she is. It is excessive and distressing, much more so than just normal life. It's not like she's uncomfortable around birds or she doesn't like them. It's excessive. So phobic disorder, excessive distressing and persistent fear or anxiety about a specific object or situation. Now, another kind of anxiety disorder is not focused on one particular thing. We're going to call this generalized anxiety disorder. This is long-term persistent anxiety and worry. In order to get this diagnosis, you have to have this persistent anxiety and worry more days than not for at least 6 months. So if you think about this as a week, at least 4 days of every week for 6 months, you had persistent anxiety and worry. And it's oftentimes accompanied by restlessness, difficulty concentrating, real exhaustion and fatigue, muscle tension, irritability, difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep. It's really, really life altering. And it's very common. 5.7% of the US population will get the generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis at some point in their life. And women are twice as likely to get it as men. And you can see how people with this, they're not afraid of spiders and they can just avoid spiders. They're not afraid of closed spaces and they can sort of like just avoid elevators and avoid small spaces. They're worried about all different things. They're worried about their finances. They're worried about their kids. They're worried about nuclear war. They're worried about the environment. They've got worries in all different areas. It's not just in one small situation or area. It's generalized. It's all over the place. And it lasts for a long time, more days than not for 6 months. Think about how awful that would be. And it's common. Almost 6% of the people will get this diagnosis at some point in their life. And if you're a female, it's double that. So over 10%. And that's a lot of people. There's 30 of you in this class. So over 30 of you. So 3 of you, well, I guess I should say 1.5 of you with the sexes combined, if there are 30 women in this class, 3 of you would be likely statistically to end up getting diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. And we'll talk about the treatments for these disorders in the next chapter. Another anxiety disorder is panic disorder. And panic attacks are very, very common. So panic attacks, 23% of people will have a panic attack at least once in their life, and you won't get diagnosed with the disorder of having panic disorder. So what happens in a panic attack is someone just all of a sudden will feel impending doom, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, sweating, dizziness. Their palms go sweat, their mouth goes dry, their heart is beating out of their chest, their stomach, they're not hungry at all, they can't eat. They're in that fight, flight, or freeze mode, but they're for no apparent reason. And it can last for a few seconds to a few hours. It's a terrible, terrible feeling. Okay. I was once in flying with my daughter and I forget where we were flying, but we were going on a trip somewhere. And for some reason, she and I were not seated next to one another. And there was a woman who was sitting next to me. And I looked over and noticed that all of a sudden she was crying. She had beads of sweat on her forehead. She was trembling. She had her hands around the armrests like this. Her knuckles were almost turning purple. And of course, I turned to her and said, "Are you okay?" And she was like, "I'm terrified. I'm having a panic attack. I'm so afraid of flying." So she had a phobia that had turned into a panic disorder. And so she was having just a panic attack on the flight. My daughter at the time had worked on a suicide hotline and was getting some training to be a clinical. She wasn't in the PhD program yet, but she was getting some training to be a clinical psychologist and thought she knew more than I. I called her over and she said to the woman, "We need to have you use your senses. So look for something that's pink right now." And the woman was looking all over for something that's pink. My daughter asked the flight attendant to get ice and put some ice behind the woman's neck. And she asked the woman to feel the chair underneath her legs. In other words, to feel a touch of something, to smell something, to listen to her voice. So there's something that can be helpful in a panic disorder to become aware of your 5 senses. What am I looking at? What am I smelling? What am I tasting? What am I feeling? And if you can get grounded in your senses in your body, oftentimes some of the panic disorder symptoms will go away or stop at least for a little bit. So this is the panic disorder. It can feel like a heart attack. It can feel like you're going to die. Your textbook will tell you how people sometimes will end up in the emergency room for this. It's so severe. They think that they're having a heart attack. So in order to get the diagnosis of panic disorder, you have to have more than just one panic attack. And it's about 4% of people will get the actual diagnosis of panic disorder. A common anxiety disorder is social anxiety disorder. This is extreme, persistent fear and avoidance of social situations in which a person could be evaluated negatively by others. So many of us don't enjoy public speaking. I'm one of those. I like it now a lot more, but when I was a graduate student training to become a researcher and a teacher, they gave me a social psychology class to teach one semester. And the first time I went to stand in front of, it was like 50 people in a tiered room. When I stood in front of everyone, I started vomiting. And I vomited before a class every day for, I think, the first 2 weeks. It might have even been the first 3 weeks. It came to I was starting to lose weight. I was vomiting so often from it. But that's not a social anxiety disorder. I would throw up and then stand up in front of everyone and do it. And it was more extreme than, other fears that I might have. But it wasn't so extreme that I couldn't do what I needed to do. And eventually I started enjoying standing in front of the students and talking. and now do it for a living. So but you could see how a social anxiety disorder would be what I had times 3 maybe. And so it gets to the point where you go, I can't have this career. I cannot further train to be a researcher because most researchers have to teach. And I wanted to teach too. Uh, I can't have this career of teaching because I'm too afraid of speaking in public in front of people. Um, well, then that's now going to be a social anxiety disorder. And I would have to have gotten help for it in order to get my career. And I would have met the criteria for the diagnosis. Does that make sense? So some people have social anxiety disorder about meeting strangers or eating in public or using a public restroom. So there's all different kinds of versions of social anxiety disorder. Okay, so social anxiety disorder. 12% of all people in the US will be diagnosed with social anxiety disorder at some point in their life, most often from public speaking. Okay, and the last anxiety disorder that we're going to talk about is obsessive compulsive disorder. And obsessive compulsive disorder has 2 components to it, the obsession and the compulsion. The obsession are intruding thoughts and urges that occur to the person constantly. And then the compulsion is the behavior that they do to get rid of those obsessive thoughts. So someone might have this thought that's very intrusive. It comes to mind several times a day, several times maybe even in an hour. The thought might be, ooh, my hands are dirty. And the thought comes with so much anxiety. My hands are dirty. There's stuff on my hands. That then if they go and wash their hands, it reduces that anxiety. That thought then goes away and they're able to go back to doing whatever they're wanting to do, whatever they want to think about. So the obsession is the thought, my hands are dirty, and the anxiety, my hands are dirty. The compulsion is the washing the hands, which reduces the anxiety. So obsessive compulsive disorder, oftentimes people will know how irrational or illogical it is. They'll know my hands can't be that dirty. I just washed them 5 minutes ago and I haven't been in contact with anything for the last 5 minutes. But it doesn't make the intrusion, the intrusive thought go away. So the thought comes, and the best way to get rid of it is to do the compulsion. And people with, we call this for short OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, people with OCD sometimes will wash their hands so many times that they become raw, red. It really ends up affecting their life negatively. For some, it becomes really hard to hold down a job because the thoughts are just so intrusive. And then these behaviors that they have to do to get rid of them are so compulsive that they spend hours and hours and hours each day doing this. I've got a short video in the supplementary information videos that talks more about OCD. If you have a loved one who has this disorder, or if you think you might have this disorder. By the way, that's a common thing that happens when I start talking about disorders, is that people will start to think that they have it even though they might not. We call it the availability heuristic. I'm making these things more available to you, or priming. I'm priming you with these things, and then you start to see them in yourselves and in others. And oftentimes you won't have it, but you'll start to notice it around you. So this is obsessive compulsive disorder. There's some OCD or obsessive compulsive related disorders like hoarding. I talked about hoarding a little bit in the video instructions for your writing assignment. I think in that video, I called up the DSM-5 criteria for hoarding. So with hoarding, there's compulsive collecting of things that are of no value at all. I think there's some TV shows, documentaries showing people who are living in homes where they can barely walk through their house because they've just got so much hoarding. They've collected so many things. And when the therapist is there trying to help them to get rid of the items, they just go into extreme anxiety, even at the thought of discarding some of these things. And there's other OCD related disorders, compulsive pulling at the hair from your scalp or your eyebrows, picking at your skin, body dysphoria disorder, thinking that there's your nose just isn't right, and you're just obsessed with it. And sometimes people will get, have surgery to change the way their nose looks. And then when that's fixed, then there'll be a different part of their body that then they'll become very dissatisfied with. And so there was really nothing wrong with their nose. That was just the area that the anxiety went to. And so they can be diagnosed with body dysphoric disorder. And surgery is not going to be the best way to deal with that. So those are the anxiety disorders that I want you to know about that are in your book. Oh, this is a slide about hoarding, how much the hoarding behavior can influence the quality of someone's life. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about the last of these anxiety disorders, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is an anxiety disorder that develops through exposure to a traumatic event, and then it overwhelms the person's ability to cope. There can be flashbacks, avoiding emotional experiences, an exaggerated startle response, especially if it reminds someone of something that happened at with the trauma. Sleeping difficulties, when someone finally goes to sleep, they have nightmares over the trauma, real problems with memory and concentration because there's so many intrusive thoughts of the trauma. They keep thinking about the trauma over and over again. And of course, with the lack of sleep and the inability to concentrate and the constant intrusive thoughts about this very traumatic and disturbing event, there's going to be some impulsive outbursts like, be quiet over there in the corner. I'm dealing with all this stuff. So PTSD is a real problem. And years back, it was called war fatigue or shell shock. People with PTSD with that diagnosis are 8 times more likely to commit suicide than the people without this disorder. So it is very important that if you have this disorder that you seek help. And we've got really good, really great therapies out there for PTSD. There's some medication that can help to reduce the anxiety. There's also EMDR therapies and some other therapies that really have been talk therapies that have been found to be very helpful with PTSD. So post-traumatic stress disorder. I've got another short video about PTSD, again, in that supplementary videos that you might find helpful. All right, now let's move to the mood disorders. And mood disorders are disturbances in emotional feelings strong enough to interfere with daily living. And when we're talking about mood disorders, I'm really going to talk about 2 in particular, focus on 2. I would like to talk about major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. So let's begin with depression. All right, actually, before I begin with depression, let me talk in general about the mood disorders. So mood disorders are characterized by massive disruptions in mood. Symptoms can range from extreme sadness and hopelessness of depression to extreme elation and irritability of mania. So it's anything that is a massive disruption of your mood. You can't get out of bed every day, or you're talking a mile a minute and you're like, oh my goodness, I can do everything. And I'm going to cook this, I'm going to do this, and let me go grocery shopping because I can do everything. And I'm going to prep for a month, and I'm look around freezing everything. So it's both sides. So mood disorders involve massive disruptions in mood. So let's talk about major depression. And major depression is a very, very, very common psychological diagnoses or psychological disorder. You have to have some or all of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks. Overwhelming sadness and hopelessness, a loss of interest or enjoyment in activities, fatigue, oftentimes with trouble sleeping. So you're exhausted that you can't go to sleep. Loss of energy, all you want to do is lie on the couch and do nothing. Difficulty sleeping, which can lead to not sleeping enough or sleeping way more than a normal person would need to sleep. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty concentrating, and sometimes suicidal ideation. Now, it is normal to experience this for a day or two, and it's normal to experience this after certain events. So, your kid gets really sick, or you find out your husband has cancer, then of course you're going to have overwhelming sadness and some hopelessness. And you're not going to be interested in going on a bike ride, even if that's something you normally enjoy. You're probably not going to want to eat. And when you go to sleep, you're probably going to have a hard time sleeping. And you're probably going to feel like, oh, I should have become a medical doctor and spent my whole life trying to understand cancer. And now I'd be able to help my husband more. And so there's maybe some feelings of I don't know enough. And maybe if I had eaten more healthy with him, then and let him eat more healthy, he wouldn't have the cancer. And if you're sitting listening to this video, you're probably like, what is she even talking about? I'm so focused on the fact that my husband has cancer, I can't really concentrate on anything else. That would all be very normal. You would not get the major depressive diagnosis from that. With major depression, you're going to have all or some of these symptoms for at least 2 weeks, usually without a cause of why it would happen. So if you found out your husband had cancer, it would be very normal and common to have this maybe for a few days, maybe even for a week, but it's probably not going to last for more than 2 weeks. And so if it lasts for more than 2 weeks, major depression is likely what's going on. Major depression is very common, and we really know that serotonin and norepinephrine, those two of the neurotransmitters that we talked about, really seem to play a huge role in causing major depression. So what we kind of think now sometimes is that someone has, all of a sudden something goes wrong with the serotonin or the norepinephrine, and so you feel really down and lousy, and you lose interest in things, and you're tired, and you don't want to eat, or you're eating everything in sight, and you're having all of these common symptoms. And you look around and go, why am I feeling so bad? And so then you go, well, you know what? My job must not be that fulfilling, or I must be just not happy in my marriage. It must be my husband's fault, or I don't really like being a mom. And so we kind of will say, oh, I'm feeling sad because of these things in life, but it may have nothing to do with those actual things. It's the neurotransmitters in your brain not working the way that they're supposed to work. And so it's so easy to think it's something you're in your environment, but it might not be at all. So that's major depressive disorder, very common. And again, I should say it's extreme. So it's not just feeling sad. So I have 3 sisters who suffer from major depression, and one of my sisters I was in contact with when she was having some suicidal ideation, and when she wasn't suicidal anymore, I said to her, you know, if you ever completed suicide, I would mourn for you for my whole life. You would like rob me of some life satisfaction and happiness. Like, how could you ever think that, please don't do that. How could you ever think that would be a good thing to do or a good alternative? And she said her experience was that your mind is so confused and your thoughts are so confused that in her experience, she said at that moment, it felt like I would be doing everyone a favor if I just didn't exist anymore. She said, Mary, it really felt like if I completed suicide, I would make your life better. That you're having to deal with me and my hopelessness and sadness and all my issues is such a burden. And not just to you, Mary, but to the whole world. It's like I'm undeserving of the oxygen I breathe. That she felt like the whole world would be better off without her. And so that's how extreme this gets. It's different than just being sad. And not that any of us enjoy being sad, and that being sad for a couple of days doesn't suck. It does, but it's not major depression. Major depression is much more severe. It lasts for at least 2 weeks. Now, some people can have high functioning major depression, where even with the major depression, they're able to go to work. they're not working at their optimum. They're not as creative as they could be. They're not enjoying life to the level that they could be. And for some people, it is so debilitating that they can't get out of bed. And if you've had one major depressive episode, an episode where you can't go out of bed, then it's likely that you'll have more than one. The probability of having a second one increases dramatically. And with each one, the likelihood of another one increases dramatically. And so that's a point where you go, okay, this might be something that I'm going to have to manage for my whole life, much the way someone who has diabetes has to manage that for their whole life. Okay, now let's talk about bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is different than major depression. With bipolar disorder, there are alternate moods. And so some people have the type of bipolar disorder where they'll have periods of being depressed and periods of having mania. And with mania, there's this huge state of exhilaration and energy and impulsive behavior. People that I know that have had bipolar disorder, someone in our faculty in the psychology department used to have it. She left Cameron and then she's since passed away. So I don't think any of you would know her, but and she was very open, telling students how she had bipolar disorder. When she would be in a manic episode, it was so easy for me to tell. When I would talk with her, her rate of speech would be so fast, and she'd be talking about, oh, it's going to be the best semester ever. You know, instead of just having one assignment or two assignments in my class, I'm going to have 15 different assignments, and they're all going to build on one another, and the students going to learn so much. It's just going to be fantastic. It's going to be awesome. And you're like, whoa, why don't you not make any changes to your syllabus till next week? Why don't you just think this over before you change anything? Sometimes in a manic episode, people will spend tons of money. Sometimes they'll, they just go and go and go and go. It seems as though they don't need sleep at all. And then they followed by depressive episodes. So bipolar used to be called manic depression. That was a long time ago. About 1% of all people will be diagnosed with bipolar. I shared with you about how my daughter's mentor, Steve Hinshaw's father, had in some of his periods of mania, he would have hallucinations. That's even less common than regular bipolar disorder, but it does happen. So only 1% of the people have this disorder, and there seems to be a real genetic or physiological component to it. If an identical twin has it, the chances of the other identical twin being diagnosed with it is much higher than it is with a non-identical brother or sister, or not twins, and certainly higher than in the regular population. So there seems to be a genetic component to bipolar disorder. And you can see here with the identical twins, it's just so much more likely than fraternal twins that don't share the same DNA and the general population. You can see that in that slide. Okay. Oh, this is a cool finding. The depressed individuals react to negative emotional stimuli, like sad faces, with greater amygdala activation than non-depressed people. So when someone is depressed, the way their brain is working, even the way the brain takes in information from the environment can actually lead them to continue to stay depressed. So it really, and same thing if you're bipolar and in a depressive episode, it really ends up having a lot of, it can be very debilitating. Okay, why don't we stop here, and in the next video, I will talk about schizophrenia. Remember, if you have any questions, please email me at maryd@cameron.edu or marydz@cameron.edu. And there's more information about all of these different disorders in that supplementary information folder, especially if, as I'm talking about this, you think you or one of your family members or good friends might have the disorder. You probably want more information. All right.